This video will walk you through typical Chapter 10 conceptual and definitional questions. Question number 1 says, the material price variance is computed by multiplying the difference of the actual price and standard price by the actual quantity of materials used in production. Well, before we go for the answers, a couple things we want to do. First of all, we want to look at the formula for the material price variance using our formula sheet. Material price variance, actual quantity times the difference of actual price minus standard price. So, material price variance equals the actual quantity times the difference of actual price minus standard price. Now, one of the things you may have missed in your reading is on page 435. They tell you there's a subtle difference between material price variance and the actual quantity we use versus the material quantity variance. Material quantity variance is standard price times the difference of actual quantity versus standard quantity. When we talk about the material price variance, the price variance is talking about quantity purchased. The material quantity variance is talking about the quantity used in production. So these two numbers many times is not the same. So again, on page 435, when you talk about the material price variance, we want to pick out the quantity purchased, versus when we talk about the material quantity variance, it's the quantity used. So looking again at this question and what it said, it says price variance is computed by multiplying the difference between actual price and standard price. There's the difference of actual price minus standard price by the actual quantity of materials used. And that's what's wrong. It's not used, it's what's purchased. So that's why this is false. 2. In general, the purchasing agent is responsible for the material price variance, and that's going to be true. The purchasing agent is the one that's going to make all the contracts with the vendors that decides what the price is going to be for our materials. 3. A material price variance is favorable if the actual price exceeds the standard price. So the material price variance. And the key here is, again, material price variance is the actual quantity purchased times the actual price minus the difference of the standard price. For this to be favorable, the standard price has to be greater than the actual price, because the price I pay needs to be less than my standard says it should be in order for me to get an actual favorable variance. So this says my actual price exceeds the standard price, which is false. Again, my actual price needs to be less than my standard price. And what that's going to give us then is a negative difference. When I take the difference of actual price minus standard price, I should get a negative number. And I multiply that negative number by the actual quantity used, and that negative number tells me it'll be favorable. Generally speaking, it is the responsibility of the production department to see the material usage is kept in line with standards. So again, material usage, how much are we using in production, is part of the production department's responsibility, and more specifically, your factory manager's responsibility. Because again, the amount of material we use is directly tied to training of our people, the calibration of equipment, and that's all falls on the responsibility of production. 5. When more hours of labor time are necessary to complete a job than the standards allow, the labor rate variances is unfavorable. So again, going to our formula sheet, labor rate variances equals the actual hours times the difference in rates. So labor rate variance equals actual hours times the difference in my actual rate minus my labor rate. And what it said here is that when more hours of labor are necessary to complete a job than standards allow, well, all I'm using is actual hours in the labor rate variance. We don't compare it to standard hours. So that's why this is false. So you can see it really takes and makes that you will make less mistakes if you take the time to write a formula out based on what variance it's asking you to focus on in these conceptual questions, and then look at what it's saying. And again, it said actual hours versus standard hours. Well, there is no standard hours in this formula, so it can't be correct. 6. Standard cost should generally be based on actual costs of prior periods. Well, standard costs is benchmarks or norms. So it's not based on actual costs of prior periods. It's based on what is the norm in order to produce what we want to produce. So that's going to be false. Next question. Oops. Sorry, guys. It's the only thing, like I said about the tablet, it gets a mind of its own sometimes. Here we go. 7. The standard quantity per unit for direct material should not include an allowance for waste. So that's saying when I figure out what is my standard quantity per unit, how many pounds of material should I use to produce 1 unit of something, you should include any waste, any spoilage. So this is going to be false, because I want to know, again, what's my norm? What is the total amount of material I need to purchase based on what I use? And therefore I've got to include allowance for waste and spoilage. 8. Ideal standards should be used for forecasting and planning, and that's going to be false. We want to make it attainable. Ideal says everything has to fall just in place, which is very hard to do in the real world. 9. The standard cost per unit is computed by multiplying the standard quantity of hours by the standard price or rate. So the standard cost per unit, so that's saying what is my, if I said that I use 2 pounds per unit and it costs me $1 per pound. Therefore my standard cost per unit, because pounds are going to cancel out, is going to be $2 per unit. So that's going to be true. 10. Standard costs greatly increase the complexity of bookkeeping process. Totally false. Standard costing does not change anything in how we journalize anything. Number 11. When computing the standard cost variances, the difference between actual and standard price multiplied by the actual quantity. So let's do what it says here. The difference between actual price and standard price times the actual quantity. So let's look at our formula sheet. Actual quantity times the difference of prices gives me my material price variance. So is that one of our answers? Price variance. So again, I'm hoping you're seeing for conceptual questions how important it is to write what they're saying and then look at the formula sheet to see what you wrote based on what they gave you. Is that correct? Number 12, the general model for calculating a price variance. And that's just saying the exact same thing we just did. And that's the difference between actual price and standard price times the actual quantity. Oops, sorry about that. So the correct answer is going to be A. 13. Todco planned to produce 3,000 units of its single product, Teragram, during November. The standard specifications of 1 unit of Teragram includes 6 pounds of materials at 30 cents per pound. Actual production in November was 3,100 units of Teragram. The accountant computed a favorable material price variance. So we had a favorable material price variance, and we had an unfavorable material quantity variance. So the first thing we want to do is go into our formula sheet. Material price variance, again we've been using it quite a bit, actual quantity times actual price minus standard price. And material quantity variance, standard price times the difference of actual quantity and standard quantity. Oops, sorry about that. Standard price times the difference of actual quantity minus standard quantity. Now again, the other thing to remember here is that this actual quantity for price, what did I purchase? So this quantity up here is my quantity purchased. This quantity is the quantity used. Other thing to remember, in order to have a favorable variance, again, favorable, unfavorable looks at what happened inside the parentheses here. To have favorable, so to have a favorable material price variance, that means I had to have my actual price had to be less than my standard price, or I got a negative number. To have an unfavorable material quantity variance, that meant that my actual quantity used had to be greater than my standard quantity, or I had a positive difference. So let's look at each of these and we can try and narrow down which one. So A says more materials were purchased than were used. Well, the key there is quantity purchased versus quantity used are never used in the same variance. So that cannot be right. So let me say that again. Quantity purchased versus quantity used is not used in the same variance. So it cannot be that cannot be a reason why we had unfavorable or favorable. B, more materials were used than were purchased. Well, it's the same thing, just a different way of saying it. So that's got to be wrong also. C, the actual cost of materials was less than the standard cost. Well, let's look at my favorable material variance here. My actual price is less than my standard price. So if I look at that, when it talks about cost, I've got to take my actual quantity times my actual price. So therefore my actual cost is less than my standard cost. The actual cost of materials was less than the standard cost. That looks like that's going to be the right answer. D, the actual uses of materials was less than the standard allowed. The actual uses of materials. So remember, actual quantity used is part of my material quantity variance. And we had an unfavorable variance here. And we had an unfavorable because my actual quantity was greater than my standard quantity. And it says my actual quantity was less than. So that can't be right. So C is the right answer. (14) The material quantity variance should be computed. The material quantity variance should be computed based on when materials are purchased. Well, again, just go back up to here again, since we just had it. Material quantity variance, the two asterisks, quantity used. When materials are purchased. B, based upon amount of materials used in production. C, based upon difference between actual and standard prices per unit times the actual quantity used. Or D, only when there is a difference between standard and actual cost per unit for the materials. So again, we're talking about material quantity variance. So material quantity variance we know is equal to my standard price times my actual quantity minus my standard quantity. And we know that my actual quantity is going to be my quantity used. So A, when materials are purchased, can't be right. That's material price variance. B, based upon the amount of materials used. Based upon the amount of materials used. Looks like it might be the right answer. C, based upon the difference between actual and standard prices. That's not that variance, so that's got to be wrong. Only when there's a difference between standard and actual cost per unit for the materials. Between the difference between standard and actual cost. That's the same thing as, that's saying again that it's going to be my difference between my prices, like this is saying, times my quantity. And that's wrong. That's talking about my price variance again. So that's wrong. So B has got to be the correct answer. Next one. Tower Company planned to produce 3,000 units of a single product during November. The standard for 1 unit of Titactium specified 6 pounds of materials at 30 cents per pound. Actual production in November was 3,100 units. There was an unfavorable material price variance. So, unfavorable material price variance and a favorable material quantity variance. So this is the opposite of question 13. So again, material price variance is my actual quantity purchased times the difference of my actual price minus my standard price, versus quantity variance is going to be my standard price times the difference of my actual quantity used minus my standard quantity that we should have used. So here, unfavorable, looking at this here, in order for it to be unfavorable, that says my actual price, so unfavorable material price variance, therefore it tells me that my actual price had to be greater than my standard price. Favorable material quantity variance means my standard quantity was greater than my actual quantity that I used. So let's see which one we can narrow this down to. A, more materials were purchased than were used. Same thing again, cannot be A, because material quantity purchased and quantity used is not used in the same variance. Same reason why B is no good. C, the actual cost per pound for materials was less than the standard cost per pound. The actual cost per pound. So the cost per pound, my actual price versus my standard price. Well, it was unfavorable because we said my actual price was greater than. This is saying the actual price was less than, so that can't be right. D, the actual use of materials was less than the standard allowed. I said my standard quantity is greater than. Another way of looking at that says my actual quantity is less than my standard quantity, which is what D is saying. So 13 and 15, you really want to probably repeat this a couple times and really go through it slowly so you really understand how I went through this. But again, if you get those two, you really do understand variance analysis. Okay, 16. If the labor rate efficiency variance is unfavorable. So again, let's go to our formula sheet. Labor rate efficiency variance. So labor efficiency variance says standard rate times the difference of hours. Times actual hours minus my standard hours. So it's unfavorable. So for us to have unfavorable here, that tells me that my actual hours had to be greater than my standard hours because we had a positive number. A, actual hours exceeded standard hours. Sounds like I just said that. B, standard hours allowed for actual output exceeded actual hours. That would be the opposite. If standard hours was larger, we have a negative cost here, which means then it would be favorable because my actual cost would be less than my standard cost said it should be. C, the standard rate exceeded the actual rate. Well, we only use standard rate in this formula. We do not use the actual rate, so that can't be right. D, the actual rate exceeded the standard rate. Same reason there. So A has got to be the correct answer. 17. A labor efficiency variance resulting from the use of poor quality materials should be charged to who? So again, the labor efficiency variance resulting from use of poor quality materials. Well, who's buying the poor quality materials? Well, that's going to be the purchasing agent. Okay, last one. Variable manufacturing overhead is applied to products on the basis of standard direct labor hours. So we're applying it using a POHR based on direct labor hours. If the direct labor efficiency variance is unfavorable, the variable overhead efficiency variance will be. So what does that mean? Well, first thing we want to do is, what is the formula for the direct labor efficiency variance? Go into our trusty formula sheet. Labor efficiency variance is standard rate times the difference of our hours. So, labor efficiency variance is going to be my standard rate times the difference of actual hours minus standard hours. And if it's unfavorable, what does that mean? Well, that means my actual hours are greater than my standard hours. And if you look at the variable overhead efficiency, is the same formula, standard rate, but the standard rate here now, the standard rate for labor efficiency is what is the rate that I pay my workers? The variable overhead rate is going to be what is my variable portion of my predetermined overhead rate. So I'll say that again. So when we talk about the variable overhead efficiency variance, that looks like it's the same formula. And the actual hours are the same and the standard hours are the same. What is different is that the standard rate here is the standard rate that I pay my laborers, which is my direct laborers. The standard rate here is the variable portion of the predetermined overhead rate. Two different things. But the key is, if it is unfavorable, what is going to be unfavorable is that the standard hours are less than the actual hours used. And therefore, if my labor efficiency variance is unfavorable, guess what? Your variable overhead efficiency variance is going to be also unfavorable because it uses the same standard hours and the same actual hours. So the correct answer is going to be B.